Welcome to the new episode of the IEFA Conversation Series. I'm Swaha Pattanaik, Global Economics Editor of Reuters Breakingviews, and it's a pleasure to join Laurence Boone in Paris, virtually, but still a pleasure to see you, Laurence.
Pleasure to see you as well, Swaha.
Right, there's so much to discuss, and there's so much difficulty these days in predicting what's going to happen. But let's look a little more long range. How do you think the coronavirus will change the social contract between governments and their citizens? Are our minimum expectations of what the state should provide change once this is over?
So I think you're right to consider changes to the social contract, because this crisis is very unique in the sense that it affects everybody, all countries, all sectors of the economy at the same time. And usually crises are more contained within one sector or one geographical area of the world. It's also quite striking how the crisis is widening inequalities, because it's affecting people living in dense areas, those who are not well covered by social insurance the most. It's also, easier to keep teleworking if you're doing a more qualified job, and you're usually better paid. And the same, it will widen inequality between countries, between advanced economies and emerging market economies. And if we look ahead, I think what will come out of it is probably three things. One is a call for better balancing resilience and efficacy. A second one for better social security and fairness. And the third will be more preparation for risks. And when we talk about each of those, then what we mean by balancing resilience and efficacy is paying more attention to the value chains, making sure they're diversified, making sure that you have enough stocks as well, that it's not so much time and demand type of production. It's also making sure that there are perhaps longer term contracts between suppliers and people ordering those contracts. But it's also paying attention to healthcare risks, to climate risks, to cybersecurity risks, and that will require some heavy involvement from government. And finally, I think when we look at the inequality issue and how much social safety net have been called in this crisis, then I think it will lead to at least some discussion and consultation about how you can make sure that growth is indeed more inclusive, and also, how can you correct some market failure, like the wages of some people who have been really fighting during the crisis, people in supermarkets, in healthcare, hygienic sector. Usually the market value of what they do is less than the social value of what they do, and we really will have to think about this.
Right. And if we are going to see a shift towards slightly sort of stronger and more permanent welfare safety nets or higher wages for key workers in healthcare and the like, who do you think is going to end up paying for this? We had years of austerity after the global financial crisis. There isn't really the appetite politically to do that again.
So one good thing about economic history is that we tend to learn from previous crises. And I'm sure you remember that during just after the financial crisis around 2010, then there was strict austerity being enforced actually pretty much across the advanced economies world. And these had severely undermined the pace and the strength of the recovery. And I think it's quite clear for everybody today that we must not repeat this mistake. And also because of the peculiar nature of this crisis, it makes it all the more compelling. I don't think we'll see a V-shaped recovery, partly because borders will remain closed for a while, partly because some sectors will remain really in difficult condition for a long time. You can think about restaurants, hotels, we can think about events, tourism, obviously. So we are actually in a transition phase between lockdown and between what the normal world will look like. And this transition phase is likely to last for a while because we don't have a treatment, we don't have a vaccine, we have to create those. So this is a phase that will likely run into perhaps until next summer, 2021. And that is, we should keep in mind when talking about, who will pay for it. I think at the moment, in the phase we are with the confinement, the question should be, how do you adapt very wide-ranging measures that provided a super buffer to the lockdown to something that's more agile and more flexible, more targeted towards some sector, more targeted towards some workers, so that we can start the reallocation of capital from firms who may not recover towards those who will grow faster, like in healthcare or in the digital economy. And the same with people. We must make sure that people do not stay trapped into jobs in firms that won't be able to strive anymore, but that they can rebound very quickly into the growing sectors.
Great. A couple of things that you've already brought up. Let me sort of highlight the issue that you're talking about, supply chains. What about globalization? There's been decades of belief that globalization is beneficial for all. We were getting that challenged even before the coronavirus with the trade wars. Do you think there's going to be a fundamental reassessment of how much needs to be produced within domestic borders, whether borders control needs to be more stringent? How do you see globalization working out after this?
That's as interesting question as it is difficult to answer, but I think you're right. I would look at the global value chain, perhaps borders, also what globalization means when we think about international cooperation. So in terms of value chains, I think we have to keep in mind that this pandemic is an absolutely extraordinary event. If you take an example, the surge of demand for masks probably exceeded way beyond the production capacity at the time the virus outbreak materialized. So we would have run into trouble anyhow. But that's not to say that we shouldn't prepare for the future. And here, I think this idea of onshoring everything is not appropriate, because that would likely mean two things. First, a sharp increase in the production cost in the countries, in the advanced economies, in the countries onshoring or reshoring, and that obviously would hurt consumer. But it would also mean obviously putting into trouble some of the developing economies who are in the global production chain and who benefit from it in terms of catching up with more wealthy economy. And the third thing is, I'm not even sure that's the most efficient thing to do. Rather, you have several options. One would be to diversify the suppliers getting into the value chain. So it's true, some of them are very concentrated with one country. So geographical diversification is good. Another thing is, again, perhaps we should have more inventories when it comes to health protection equipment or other essential goods. A third avenue to explore is governments committing to, long-term demand and command from some specific equipments who are very crucial in the crisis. I think that's for the global value chain, and it's wiser to take a higher level view like what we are doing now. In terms of borders, I think it's fair to say that some of them, some of them will remain closed as long as the pandemic fight is not over, and that will take some time, and it may change also people's behavior in terms of how often they travel, whether it's for tourism purposes or whether it's for business purposes. You and I are doing Zoom now, and many people are doing a lot of things by Zoom, and it's very convenient to use video conference and things like that. And the third thing, I think it's international cooperation. Here, I think it's fair to say that we could have done a lot more in this crisis. First, to address the pandemic issue, that sharing data, sharing experiences, sharing lessons for confinements to how it spreads. We don't even measure fatality rate in the same way, or the death we don't measure in the same way. And if we don't have the right data, then we cannot do good analysis and policy recommendation. I think it's also the case that the bans on medical protective equipment has not been a good thing. It has led to shortages in many regions. And that obviously, especially when it's such a crucial area like health, is not helping and has not helped in this crisis. But thanks God, those are being reduced now. And then I think there's a third element, and we really should think about it for the future, which is how much we can help all this part of the world that hasn't got the same means as us to address the pandemic and both the health aspect of it and its economic consequences. So a lot of work still on our plate when it comes to globalization.
Absolutely. You're talking there about coordination, perhaps in the health field more than anything else. One thing that has happened, not because policymakers have necessarily sat in a room together and decided, but is the monetary fiscal policy. Around the world, everybody, emerging, developed countries, have gone into uncharted waters in many cases for policies to help stimulate the economy at this really terrible time. Do you think there are any limits to what fiscal policy or monetary policy can do, either because of market-imposed restraints or just real politics, say as in Germany, about how much the ECB can do?
So I think a couple of things on this. As with other crises, there are a number of areas where we are in categories. And looking ahead, policymakers will have to face a unique situation of economies walking on one or one and a half leg while some borders remain closed, and that's what we were discussing. But are there limits? I think we should be very careful, as we discussed a minute ago, about thinking about restoring, declining debt to start with. I think what matters is the debt dynamic and making it sustainable, rather than the jump we're going to see in the level of the debt. And that obviously involves three parameters. One is the growth rate of economic activity. The other will be what we do with government spending and taxes. And the last one is the one you're mentioning now, which is central bank. I think we should be clear that higher growth is the key element to debt sustainability, which is why it's so important to be flexible and agile in this transition period and really help the economy thrive and employment thrive as fast as possible. Having said that, and focusing on taxes and spending, we mentioned social fairness and perception of social fairness earlier on, and I think it will be very important to keep that in mind when we look at taxes, when we look at spending. Taxes should be very progressive, and I don't think we can rely on these tools solely to actually adjust the debt to GDP ratio, but we should focus on progressivity. Same for spending. There will be demand for health, there will be demand for climate, for cybersecurity, for social security. So it's probably the right time to actually review the allocation of public spending and whether they are efficient in reaching out to people who really need it and the investment that we really need to do for future resilience. And then come the central banks. And I think that's where effectively we're getting into very creative territories. But here again, there's no optimal level of central bank's balance sheet. There's no optimal level of interest rate or what they can do. But I think it's fair to say that in the period ahead of us, they will have to absorb a certain amount of sovereign debt and other assets. So that's not to say at all that they should finance anything. That's not the idea. It's more that they provide a buffer to the rising debt that we are seeing now, and they keep this buffer over the period that will be needed before we reach the phase 3 of a more normal economy.
Right, thank you. I'd like to end sort of just again looking forward, but this is a horrible crisis. It's costing people their jobs, they're losing loved ones, there's enormous financial hardship for families. Having said that, can you see out of this crucible anything emerging that will make our economies or societies stronger and better in the future, that we can take perhaps as a very, very thin shred of silver lining out of what we're undergoing at the moment?
Yeah, so I think you're right, and we should look at this. It's also very good and encouraging to look at this side of things. And first and foremost, I think we should be very encouraged by the engagement that people have displayed in this crisis, by the dedication of the medical staff, the dedication of essential workers, the amount of effort that's currently being put into researching treatment and vaccine, and that's worldwide. So I think first, that has been super impressive. The other thing is, it's also been really positive and encouraging to see the rapidity with which policymakers have addressed this very unique situation, both on the epidemic side and on its economic consequences. And there really has been a focus on leaving nobody behind. And that has been obviously one of the main determinants of the size, of the magnitude, and the scope of the policy responses we have seen. I think the decisiveness and the determination to really use all the tools and instruments that were available, learning from previous crises, has been super impressive. And then I think it's bringing a lot in the way that we're looking at the medium term, and we're taking some distance from the short term, which we perhaps did not do enough previously. So that's the focus on the risk we mentioned earlier, health, climate, cybersecurity, and their interaction as well, and how to reallocate the appropriate resources for substituting some hard jobs with better ones. So I think that's the third point, which is very interesting in this crisis, and is how it's shaping the path on which we could reach a higher and more sustainable growth in all its dimensions.
Thank you. Laurence, that's great. We'll wind up here. Thank you very much for joining us from Paris. And thank you all for listening in to this new series for the IEFA. Hope to see you next time. Thanks.
Cheers, Swaha.